How does a force of 8 elite British soldiers, operating covert surveillance in one of the most dangerous regions of the Troubles, end up arrested at a police checkpoint 700 meters inside the Republic of Ireland, with enough weapons to start a small war? How does the British government, fresh from deploying the legendary SAS to crush IRA operations in South Armagh, find itself scrambling to explain why a Fijian-born soldier and 7 of his teammates were caught crossing an international border they claim not to have known existed? And how does a diplomatic incident so embarrassing that it threatened economic sanctions, involved 3 governments, and exposed systematic violations of Irish sovereignty, end with 8 convicted soldiers paying a fine smaller than a speeding ticket? Before we continue, tell me in the comments whether you knew that the SAS were operating illegally in the Republic of Ireland in 1976. Because what you are about to discover is not a story about a map-reading error. It is a story about 3 governments that all had reasons to bury the truth. Watch until the end, because the moment that defines this entire story is not the arrest itself. It is what the British had already done in the 3 months before anyone caught them. Then let's go. To understand what happened at Flagstaff Hill on that May night in 1976, one must first understand the violence that preceded it. Violence so intense that it forced the British Prime Minister to deploy special forces to a conflict they were singularly unsuited to fight. Winter in Northern Ireland, January 1976. The 4th day of that month brought 6 Catholic civilians from 2 families to their deaths in separate gun attacks by loyalist paramilitaries. At Greyhillan, near Whitecross in County Armagh, 3 members of the Reevy family were shot at their home. John Martin Reevy, 24 years old, Brian Reevy, 22, and their younger brother Anthony, 17, were targeted by the UVF's Glenanne gang. Anthony would die from his injuries several weeks later. Minutes after this attack, the same gang burst in on a reunion of the O'Dowd family and killed brothers Barry, 24, and Declan, 19, along with their Uncle Joe, 61 years old. Within 24 hours, 16 people would be dead. The following evening, a minibus carrying 11 Protestant textile workers from Glenanne Mill was stopped on the Kingsmill Road near Whitecross. Republican gunmen, posing as British soldiers, ordered the men off the vehicle and asked them to identify their religion. The one Catholic among them, Richard Hughes, was told to run away. His Protestant workmates tried to protect him, covering his hands with theirs, but he was identified and forced aside. The remaining 10 men were lined up against the bus and shot multiple times. Only Alan Black survived, despite being hit 18 times. 10 Protestant workers lay dead on a road slippery with rain and blood. The massacre was claimed by a group calling itself the South Armagh Republican Action Force. The claim was dismissed at the time, and subsequently by a 2011 Historical Inquiries Team investigation, which concluded that the Provisional IRA was responsible for what it described as a purely sectarian attack. The killings were in response to the UVF murders the previous day. The UVF was responsible for 6 of the deaths, the IRA for 10. Tit for tat. 16 people murdered in counties Armagh and Down within 24 hours. 2 days later, British Prime Minister Harold Wilson publicly announced that the Special Air Service would be formally deployed to Ulster. The deployment was publicized, placing the usually secretive SAS in the public glare and in the center of politics. In January 1976, a 12-man troop was dispatched to Bessbrook, scene of the Kingsmill attack. This initial deployment was soon bolstered by all of D Squadron. Their primary role was surveillance and intelligence gathering, accomplished through foot patrols and covert observation positions. As with counter-terrorist deployments elsewhere, A, B, D, and G squadrons would rotate in and out on 4 to 6 month schedules. The regiment, with its tendency to rely on aggression and heavy firepower, was seen by many as unsuited for the rather delicate task of policing the troubles. They would prove that assessment correct within 3 months. The deployment to South Armagh represented a significant escalation in British counterinsurgency strategy. The region had earned its nickname Bandit Country through years of successful IRA operations. The porous border with the Republic of Ireland, running for 280 miles and largely unmarked, made conventional military tactics nearly useless. IRA units could strike at British forces and then retreat across the border into safe havens beyond British jurisdiction. The British Army had suffered numerous casualties attempting to patrol this terrain using conventional methods. The decision to deploy the SAS acknowledged that standard approaches had failed. The regiment that arrived at Bessbrook Mill in January 1976 was not designed for this kind of work. Founded during the Second World War by David Stirling for operations behind enemy lines in North Africa, the SAS had built its reputation on raids, sabotage, and strikes against conventional military targets in desert warfare. The skills that made them effective in the Libyan desert or the jungles of Malaya did not necessarily translate to the politically complex environment of Northern Ireland, where the enemy was often indistinguishable from the civilian population and where every action carried diplomatic consequences far beyond the immediate tactical situation. What the British government needed in South Armagh was patient intelligence gathering, careful surveillance, and operations conducted with extreme political sensitivity. What they deployed was a force trained to be aggressive, to strike hard and fast, and to operate with minimal oversight in hostile territory. That fundamental mismatch between the force and the mission would become evident very quickly. The first high-profile action carried out by the SAS in 1976 happened in March, and it happened on the wrong side of the border. Sean McKenna was born in Monaghan in 1954, but moved to Newry, County Down. Internment Day, the 9th of August 1971, brought 17-year-old Sean and his father, also named Sean, into British custody for interrogation and imprisonment. The elder McKenna was subjected to the infamous hooded treatment for 9 days as his captors tried to break him. He was one of 14 prisoners, known as the Hooded Men, who suffered torture at the hands of the British Army during internment. The British government was later found guilty by the European Commission for Human Rights. Sean McKenna Sr. died in 1975 at 42, his death directly attributed to what had been done to him. After his release in 1975, the younger Sean moved across the border to Louth. From there, on the 12th of March 1976, at 2:30 in the morning, the SAS crossed into sovereign Irish territory and took him. McKenna was sleeping at home in Edentober when 2 armed men woke him and forced him across into Northern Ireland. Once over the border, he was officially arrested by another detachment of the British Army. The British explanation was straightforward. McKenna had been found wandering drunk in a field inside Northern Ireland. McKenna stated he had been dragged from his bed by armed men and forced across the border. Dublin, under pressure from London regarding extradition of IRA suspects, chose not to challenge the British version. No protest was lodged. None. That silence would cost lives. The McKenna abduction established a dangerous precedent. The British government had tested Irish resolve and found it wanting. The operation demonstrated that the SAS could cross the border, seize a wanted man from his home in a sovereign nation, and face no diplomatic consequences beyond private complaints that went nowhere. For the men planning future operations, the lesson was clear. The border could be treated as a tactical inconvenience rather than an international boundary that required respect. What the British did not fully appreciate was that the Dublin government's silence on McKenna came with conditions. Taoiseach Liam Cosgrave led a coalition government facing pressure from multiple directions. His failure to protest the McKenna abduction publicly did not mean he was willing to accept unlimited British incursions. It meant he was trying to maintain working relationships with London on security cooperation, while managing domestic political pressure from those who saw any accommodation with Britain as betrayal. That balancing act had limits, and those limits would be tested within weeks. 5 weeks after McKenna's abduction, the SAS killed its first person in Northern Ireland since the public deployment. Peter Joseph Cleary was born in September 1950 and became a leading member of the 1st Battalion of the Provisional IRA's South Armagh Brigade. He held the rank of staff officer, served as the unit's treasurer, and made his living as a scrap metal dealer. Author and journalist Joe Tiernan claims that Cleary was part of the 3-man IRA unit that ambushed and killed part-time UDR Corporal Robert McConnell in early April. He was widely believed to have been the mastermind behind the Kingsmill massacre. Cleary was on the run, living south of the border. On the 15th of April, 1976, 10 days after the McConnell shooting, he returned secretly to Northern Ireland, where he was promptly arrested at the home of his pregnant girlfriend outside Forkhill. An SAS team had been watching the house from observation positions as part of a week-long surveillance job. He was seized and taken to a field to await transport by military helicopter, as traveling by road was deemed too risky for British military personnel. In their account of what followed, the SAS claimed that while 4 men held lanterns guiding the aircraft to land in darkness, the young officer left to guard Cleary was forced to shoot him twice after Cleary attempted to wrest the officer's rifle away in a bid to escape. Cleary, although gravely wounded, was still alive when an NCO took the rifle from the officer who had shot him and killed him with a final 3rd shot to end his misery. Before returning the weapon to its owner, he wiped away his fingerprints. An inquest into the killing was held 9 months later. A witness who had been inside the house testified that immediately after the soldiers took Cleary away, he heard somebody crying over the ditch, then a single shot. 3 of the SAS team attended. A statement was read on behalf of the officer using the nom de guerre Soldier A. The statement defended his actions by describing Cleary as heavier and stronger than him, as well as a notorious killer. Soldier A went on to say, "As he lurched at me, my instincts as an SAS soldier took over." No prosecution followed. 2 days after Cleary's death, the Cork examiner described the killing as an act of utter folly. Peter Cleary was the first person killed by the SAS since their deployment in full force in January 1976 by order of Harold Wilson in the wake of Kingsmill. The Cleary killing revealed the operational methodology the SAS was employing in South Armagh. Week-long surveillance operations suggested a sophisticated intelligence network. The decision to extract by helicopter rather than road indicated both the level of threat perception and the resources being devoted to these operations. The controversial circumstances of the killing itself, with conflicting accounts, and a 3rd shot described as mercy, suggested rules of engagement that prioritized operational success over the niceties of prisoner handling. Whether Cleary genuinely attempted to escape or was killed while in custody would remain a matter of dispute. What was undisputed was that the SAS had demonstrated a willingness to use lethal force in circumstances that invited scrutiny. 3 weeks later, the SAS would cross the border again. This time, they would not return on their own terms. South Armagh, the district recently described by Home Secretary Merlin Rees as bandit country, borders Ireland and facilitates easy, evasive practices by the IRA. The terrain is difficult, the border porous. 280 miles of boundary between north and south, largely unmarked, made enforcement nearly impossible, although the porous nature of this divide had led to 189 inadvertent crossings by British security forces in the previous 2 years. Recent incursions had heightened sensitivity by the Garda Síochána. Bessbrook Mill became headquarters for SAS operations in the region. The facility, a former linen mill, provided a secure base from which the regiment could operate. Small teams, typically 2 men, would establish hidden positions overlooking IRA movement routes and monitor activity for days or weeks at a time. These observation posts were the primary tool for gathering intelligence on IRA operations. The teams would deploy with enough supplies to remain in position for extended periods, communicating with base via encrypted radio, building detailed pictures of IRA movement patterns and operational practices. Flagstaff Hill sits near the border, overlooking Carlingford Lough. It provided surveillance of routes used to smuggle arms and personnel from south to north. In late April or early May 1976, a 2-man observation post was established there. Malcolm Rees and Ronald Nicholson, a staff sergeant and corporal respectively, were assigned to the position. For the night in question, Trooper Ilisoni Ligari, a Fijian-born member of the SAS, and Trooper John Lawson were dispatched to collect or relieve the observation post team. Whether that observation post sat just inside Northern Ireland, as the British would later claim, or just inside sovereign Irish territory, as author Peter Taylor concluded after extensive research, would become the question that 3 governments all had reasons not to answer honestly. The selection of Flagstaff Hill as an observation post location made tactical sense regardless of which side of the border it occupied. The elevated position provided clear views of Carlingford Lough and the surrounding area. IRA units moving arms or personnel between north and south would have to pass through terrain visible from that position. From a pure intelligence-gathering perspective, it was an ideal location. From a political and legal perspective, if the position was indeed on Irish soil, as Taylor concluded, it represented a deliberate decision to violate Irish sovereignty for operational advantage. After the kidnapping and murder of Seamus Ludlow near Dundalk 4 days earlier by the loyalist Glenanne gang, Irish security forces stepped up their presence along the border. A checkpoint was established by the Garda and the Irish Army on Flagstaff Road in the townland of Cornamuckla, some 700 meters inside County Louth. The checkpoint was not randomly positioned. Irish security forces were responding to a pattern of violence in the border region and attempting to assert some control over an area that had become increasingly lawless. At 10:40 in the evening, the Garda stopped a Triumph 2000 car coming from the north with 2 men inside. The driver obeyed the signal to stop, but when questioned about their destination, the unidentified men were unwilling to leave the car until Irish Army soldiers came out of the bushes and pointed rifles at them in support of the Garda. The 2 men, who wore plain clothes, were Fijian-born Trooper Ilisoni Ligari and Trooper John Lawson, both soldiers in the SAS. After searching the car, the policemen found a Sterling submachine gun and a Browning pistol. The Garda immediately arrested them, with the help of the Army, and took them to nearby Omagh Garda station. Lawson initially claimed that they were off-duty soldiers, who became stranded while test driving the car. Ligari refused to talk about the mission we were on. The cover story Lawson attempted was implausible on its face. Off-duty soldiers do not test drive cars at night near an international border while carrying submachine guns. The story suggested either poor preparation for the possibility of being stopped or a fundamental assumption that Irish authorities would not dare detain British soldiers, regardless of the circumstances. Either way, it revealed an operational mindset that had not seriously contemplated the possibility of being held accountable by Irish law enforcement. The shotgun drew attention since the same type of weapon was used in 3 recent murders in the area. Sergeant Pat McLaughlin, commanding the Garda unit, radioed his superiors for instructions on how to deal with the men now in custody. Omagh Station was ordered to keep them until a decision was taken at governmental level in Dublin. In London, where it was 1 hour earlier, no one yet knew that 8 SAS soldiers were about to become an international incident. back at Bessbrook Mill, when Rees and Nicholson failed to make the rendezvous with Ligari and Lawson, the radio call went out. The initial assessment was an IRA ambush. What was dispatched in response to that suspected ambush would turn a border incident into a diplomatic crisis. When the soldiers manning the surveillance post failed to meet Ligari and Lawson, they radioed Bessbrook Mill. Initially, an IRA ambush was suspected. The failure to make a scheduled rendezvous in an area where the IRA was known to be active would reasonably suggest hostile action. 4 plainclothes soldiers, troopers Niall McLean, Vincent Thompson, Nigel Burchell, and Karsten Rhodes, were sent to search for their missing comrades in 2 cars, picking up Rees and Nicholson from the observation post during the search. The team carried another 3 Sterling submachine guns, a Remington pump-action shotgun, and 222 rounds of ammunition. The decision to dispatch 6 additional soldiers, all heavily armed, suggests the level of concern at Bessbrook Mill. The possibility that the IRA had captured or killed 2 SAS soldiers would have been taken very seriously. The regiment's reputation and operational effectiveness depended on never leaving men behind. What was not considered, apparently, was the possibility that the missing soldiers had been detained by Irish authorities. That possibility should have triggered a very different response, but it appears not to have been seriously contemplated. The first vehicle, a Hillman Avenger carrying Thompson, McLean, Rees, and Nicholson, drove up to the Garda checkpoint at 2:05 in the morning. Rees and Nicholson were still wearing British Army uniforms from their observation post duty. The second car, a Vauxhall Victor with Burchell and Rhodes, was stopped shortly after. The fact that Rees and Nicholson were still in uniform when they reached the checkpoint was significant. It demolished any possibility of claiming that this was anything other than an active military operation. The presence of uniformed British soldiers carrying military weapons on Irish soil could not be explained away as a navigation error by a few individuals. This was clearly an organized military operation that had crossed an international border. Rees tried to explain the situation to the Garda. "Let us go back," he said. "We are all doing the one bloody job." It was an appeal to professional solidarity, an acknowledgement that British and Irish security forces shared a common enemy in the IRA. The Garda were unmoved. The plea, "We are all doing the one bloody job," reflected a certain operational reality. British and Irish security forces did share intelligence on IRA activities. There was cooperation, albeit limited and carefully managed, between the 2 governments on security matters. But that cooperation did not extend to accepting British military operations on Irish soil without authorization. Rees was attempting to appeal to professional solidarity to paper over a fundamental violation of sovereignty. The Garda, to their credit, did not accept that framing. Irish Army soldiers surrounded both cars and aimed rifles at the SAS team. Rees, facing a choice between a firefight with the army of a nation Britain was not at war with and surrender, eventually ordered his men to hand over their weapons. The decision Rees faced in that moment was genuinely difficult. He commanded 8 heavily armed elite soldiers. The Irish forces surrounding them were professional, but not special forces. In a purely tactical sense, the SAS team might well have been able to fight their way out. But the consequences of such an action would have been catastrophic. British soldiers killing Irish soldiers on Irish soil would have created an international crisis that could have damaged Anglo-Irish relations for decades. Rees made the professional decision to surrender rather than escalate to violence. It was the right call, but it left him and his men in Irish custody with no clear path to extraction. Before dawn, all 8 were transferred to Dundalk Garda Station. The arrest and detention of 8 British Army soldiers put Irish Taoiseach Liam Cosgrave and his coalition government in a dilemma. If he released them without charge, he gave a green light for further British military incursions. If he permitted them to be put on trial and they were convicted, diplomatic relations with Britain would face a crisis not seen since partition. By sunrise, 3 governments were already working the phones. For Britain, Flagstaff Hill represented disaster on multiple levels. The elite SAS regiment, deployed with public fanfare just 4 months earlier, had been caught conducting operations on foreign soil. The soldiers were in custody in a friendly nation. Britain could not simply pressure into releasing them. The existence of systematic cross-border operations, which London had never acknowledged, was now undeniable. Prime Minister James Callaghan, who had assumed office just 1 month earlier, after Harold Wilson's unexpected resignation, inherited a crisis that threatened to define his early premiership. Callaghan was in many ways uniquely qualified to handle this crisis. He had previously served as Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary, giving him deep experience in both security matters and international diplomacy. But he was also new to the premiership, still establishing his authority within his own government and with international partners. A major diplomatic incident with Ireland in his first month in office was exactly the kind of early test that could either establish his competence or permanently damage his credibility. For Ireland, the situation was equally complicated. Taoiseach Liam Cosgrave led a Fine Gael Labour coalition already under pressure from multiple directions. Dublin was being pressed by London regarding extradition of IRA suspects. The Irish public demanded that sovereignty be defended. The arrest of 8 heavily armed British soldiers operating illegally on Irish soil could not be ignored, but prosecuting them risked economic retaliation from a far more powerful neighbor. Cosgrave faced domestic political pressure from multiple constituencies. Nationalists and Republicans demanded that the soldiers be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law as a demonstration that Irish sovereignty meant something. Moderates worried about damaging relations with Britain at a time when economic cooperation was increasingly important. Security officials worried about the implications for intelligence sharing if the incident escalated into a full diplomatic breach. Cosgrave had to navigate all of these pressures while also managing his coalition partners, who had their own political imperatives. For the United States, watching from across the Atlantic, the incident carried its own complications. Irish-American political constituencies demanded that Dublin stand firm. The CIA, already embarrassed by allegations that British intelligence had created fake CIA identity cards in the early 1970s in an attempt to link the agency with the IRA, wanted no connection to British operations that violated Allied sovereignty. The Anglo-Irish relationship, critical for any long-term Northern Ireland peace process, was at risk. The American interest in Northern Ireland was both strategic and political. Strategically, the United States needed Britain as a key NATO ally during the Cold War. Anything that destabilized British politics or created friction within the Western alliance was a concern. Politically, Irish-American voters represented a significant constituency in American politics, particularly in northeastern states. American politicians could not afford to be seen as indifferent to violations of Irish sovereignty. The State Department and CIA had to balance support for a key ally with domestic political realities and the broader goal of eventually facilitating a peace process in Northern Ireland. Ambassador Sir Arthur Norman Galsworthy was summoned to the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs for urgent consultations. The British government's priority was immediate release of the soldiers. The Foreign Office explanation was delivered with technical precision. The incursion had been unintentional, resulting from a map-reading error during routine operations. A British military source later stated that the use of a 1 to 63,000 scale map instead of a 1 to 20,000 map had led the SAS men south of the border without knowing it. Galsworthy stressed his concern about the shotgun and dagger among the confiscated weapons. Another worry was that most soldiers were in plain clothes and that the two groups had given different accounts of their presence. The map error explanation was crafted to achieve several objectives simultaneously. It provided a technical rationale that sounded plausible to those unfamiliar with military navigation. It framed the incident as an unfortunate accident, rather than a deliberate policy. It avoided any acknowledgement that cross-border operations were systematic rather than isolated. And it provided a face-saving narrative that could allow both governments to resolve the situation without either having to make fundamental concessions. A confidential memo from the Northern Ireland office called for pressure on the Irish government to discharge the soldiers on grounds that the safety of SAS men in an Irish prison could not be guaranteed. When it became clear that a trial was unavoidable, the British government hardened its position. A member of the Foreign Office proposed economic sanctions and even mooted the creation of a buffer zone along the border, which would have created a no-man's land in which the terrorists could do what they would. The progression of British pressure tactics revealed the level of concern in London. Initial requests for release gave way to warnings about soldier safety, then threats of economic sanctions, then proposals for a buffer zone that would have fundamentally altered the border arrangements between the two nations. Each escalation suggested that the British government was willing to inflict significant damage on Anglo-Irish relations, rather than accept the precedent of British soldiers being prosecuted in Irish courts for operations the British government considered legitimate counter-terrorism activities. According to sources documented in later scholarship, Prime Minister Callaghan issued threats of dire consequences to avoid prosecution. It was diplomatic blackmail wrapped in concern for soldier welfare. The Irish government understood exactly what it was. Although Director of Public Prosecutions Eamon Barnes was pressured to drop the charges, he proceeded with the case. The Special Criminal Court in Dublin granted bail, £5,000 per soldier, £40,000 total. The British government posted the bond. Within hours, a Royal Air Force helicopter evacuated all 8 men to Northern Ireland. The trial, however, would proceed. The decision to grant bail was itself a compromise. It allowed the soldiers to return to British jurisdiction, while the legal process continued. It reduced the immediate tension while preserving the principle that Irish law applied to foreign soldiers who violated Irish sovereignty. The British government, by posting bail, implicitly accepted that the soldiers would face trial. The stage was set for a legal proceeding that would be watched closely by all 3 governments. Here is what the map error explanation actually means. The British Ministry of Defence maintained that 8 elite soldiers, trained in navigation and operating in a region they had patrolled for months, managed to position an observation post, dispatch a collection team, and send a 6-man rescue force all across an international border they claimed not to have known existed. The explanation was specific, technical, and convenient. The pattern suggests otherwise. 12th of March, 1976, Sean McKenna abducted from his home south of the border. 15th of April, 1976, Peter Cleary killed just 50 meters inside Northern Ireland after being arrested following what appears to have been cross-border surveillance. 5th and 6th of May, 1976, 8 SAS soldiers arrested. 3 operations in 3 months. During 1976, there were 54 incursions by British forces into Irish territory. Author Peter Taylor, after extensive research, concluded that Rees and Nicholson were actually deployed on Irish soil. The observation post was not accidentally positioned across an international boundary. It was deliberately placed where it provided the best surveillance, regardless of which side of the border that position occupied. The use of a Fijian-born soldier for a covert operation in rural Ireland suggests either remarkable operational incompetence or a level of confidence that borders could be crossed with impunity. Ilisoni Ligari was not exactly inconspicuous in County Louth. He stuck out, as one later analysis noted, like a sore thumb. In the vocabulary of intelligence operations, the map error explanation is known as a cover story. It provides plausible deniability while avoiding acknowledgement of systematic policy. The distinction matters. One is an isolated navigation mistake by a few soldiers. The other is a deliberate strategy of cross-border operations conducted without regard for Irish sovereignty. 9 months later, in March 1977, the 8 men stood trial at the Special Criminal Court in Dublin. They were each found guilty of possession of arms and ammunition, without firearms licensing under the Firearms Act of 1925. Each soldier was fined £100, total fines £800. In modern purchasing power, approximately £500 to £600 per soldier. The weapons were returned to the British government after forensic analysis by the Garda established they had not been used in any crime under investigation. No jail time was served. No soldiers were dishonorably discharged. The conviction satisfied Irish law and British diplomacy in equal measure. Neither government wanted the alternative. For violating the sovereignty of a nation, for conducting covert military operations on foreign soil, for carrying enough weapons to fight a small war, the punishment was a fine, smaller than many speeding tickets. It was a diplomatic compromise disguised as justice. The trial itself was carefully managed by both sides. The Special Criminal Court, a non-jury court designed to handle cases related to paramilitary activity, provided a venue where political considerations could be balanced with legal requirements. The guilty verdict established the principle that Irish law applied to British soldiers who violated Irish sovereignty. The minimal fines acknowledged that the soldiers were following orders rather than acting as criminals. The return of weapons after forensic analysis demonstrated that this was about sovereignty, not criminal investigation. Every element of the proceedings was designed to allow both governments to claim they had defended their positions while avoiding a complete rupture in relations. What Flagstaff Hill revealed was not visible in courtroom proceedings or modest fines. It was visible in what happened next, and in what did not happen at all. Cross-border operations continued. The SAS remained deployed to Northern Ireland, with squadrons rotating in and out on 4 to 6 month schedules for another 20 years. No formal agreement was reached regarding border operations. Intelligence cooperation between British and Irish services actually increased in the years following the incident. Between 1976 and 1978, the SAS killed 10 people in Northern Ireland. 7 were IRA volunteers, 3 were bystanders. The conviction changed procedures, not policy. The British learned to use helicopters more and roads less near the border. Operational security was enhanced. Deniability measures were refined. But the fundamental approach, that military necessity in the fight against the IRA, justified actions that would have been unthinkable against any other neighboring democracy, remained unchanged. The genius of the compromise, if it can be called that, was that it allowed all 3 governments to claim satisfaction while changing almost nothing about the reality on the ground. The British could tell Parliament that soldiers were held accountable. The Irish could tell their public that sovereignty had been defended. Both could quietly agree that the fight against the IRA mattered more than the legal niceties of where exactly that fight took place. The Americans, watching from across the Atlantic, could maintain their alliance with both. It was a structure built on public conviction and private understanding. The SAS would continue operating in South Armagh until the Good Friday Agreement transformed the political landscape 2 decades later. There is one detail from the months that followed that the record of this operation demands. Sean McKenna, the young man abducted from his bed in March 1976, was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. He joined the blanket protest, and when a hunger strike began in October 1980, was among the first prisoners to participate. By day 48, he had become seriously ill and was blind. On the 53rd day of his fast, he slipped into a coma. Brendan Hughes, the IRA leader commanding the protest, was warned that McKenna had just hours to live, but that a document from the British Home Office was on its way, which would meet the prisoners' demands. Hughes had sworn to McKenna that he wouldn't let him die if convinced the demands would be met. With no way to tell how sick McKenna really was, Hughes accepted the settlement and ended the fast. McKenna survived, but never fully recovered. Sean McKenna died in December 2003. He was 49 years old. The health effects of 53 days without food, the trauma of being dragged from his bed and forced across a border in the middle of the night, the years in prison that followed, these are not separable from the British decision to ignore Irish sovereignty in March 1976. The SAS operation that took him was considered a success. McKenna was convicted and imprisoned. What the assessment of success did not include was what the operation cost the man himself, or whether that cost was worth the intelligence gained. Those calculations were not part of the operational debrief. McKenna's fate illustrates the human cost of the operational decisions made in early 1976. The abduction that the Dublin government chose not to protest publicly set in motion a chain of events that would mark McKenna for the rest of his life. His 25-year sentence, his participation in the blanket protest, where prisoners refused to wear prison uniforms as a protest against being treated as criminals rather than political prisoners. His near-death experience during the hunger strike, the permanent damage to his health, his death at 49. Each of these events connected back to that March night when the SAS crossed the border and took him from his bed. The full accounting of what Flagstaff Hill reveals requires stepping back from specific events to examine the structure that made them possible. The SAS was created during the Second World War for operations behind enemy lines in North Africa. The regiment was designed for desert warfare, hostage rescue, and strikes against conventional military targets. Its strength was aggression, firepower, and the ability to operate independently in hostile territory. These were precisely the characteristics that made it unsuited for the delicate political environment of Northern Ireland. The application of special forces to counterinsurgency in a region where every action carried political consequences was fundamentally problematic. Cross-border operations were militarily logical. South Armagh IRA units used Irish territory as a safe haven, crossing back and forth to conduct attacks and then retreat beyond British jurisdiction. From a purely tactical perspective, disrupting that safe haven made operational sense. From a political perspective, it was catastrophic. Each cross-border incursion violated the sovereignty of a democratic ally. Each violation damaged the Anglo-Irish relationship that would eventually prove essential to any peace settlement. Each operation without coordination created the conditions for incidents like Flagstaff Hill, where professional soldiers executing their mission created international crises their political masters could barely contain. All three governments failed, each in different ways. The British government assumed that military necessity in fighting terrorism trumped normal constraints of international law and Allied sovereignty. The Irish government accepted violations until publicity forced action, then struggled to balance sovereignty with diplomatic relations. The American government maintained silent complicity in operations that, had they been conducted by any other nation against a U.S. ally, would have prompted strong condemnation. Lieutenant Colonel Brian Beatty commanded the SAS unit involved in the Peter Cleary killing and the Sean McKenna abduction. He retired in 1984 after 33 years of service, and later became involved with Keeny Meany Services, a private military contractor made up of former British soldiers. Beatty died in May 2020. The soldiers who served under his command executed their missions as trained. The failure was not theirs. The failure was institutional. It was the decision to deploy a force built for desert warfare and hostage rescue to police a sectarian conflict where every bullet carried political weight. It was the decision to conduct operations across an international border without coordination with the nation whose sovereignty was being violated. It was the decision to assume that elite military capability somehow exempted operations from political constraints that governed conventional forces. Rees attempted negotiation when confronted at the checkpoint. He ordered surrender when outmatched. He conducted himself professionally throughout detention and trial. The soldiers paid £100 each. The institutions learned nothing. Flagstaff Hill was not an isolated embarrassment. It was a symptom of a broader institutional problem that continues to shape how democracies deploy special forces in counter-terrorism operations. Elite military units operate under different rules than conventional forces, with less oversight and greater latitude for action. That latitude serves important purposes in certain operational environments. It becomes dangerous when political constraints are treated as obstacles to be circumvented rather than boundaries to be respected. The pattern that Flagstaff Hill exposed runs deeper than one regiment's operations in one region during one conflict. It connects to ongoing debates about special forces accountability, the balance between operational security and democratic oversight, and the question of whether elite capability justifies exceptional treatment under international law. These questions remain unresolved decades later. The institutional verdict on Flagstaff Hill has not improved with time. The British Ministry of Defence maintained for decades that 8 SAS soldiers wandered across an international border because they were reading the wrong map. The same institution that produced that verdict had no contingency for what happened when those soldiers were arrested by the police force of a friendly nation. The knowledge that proved decisive was not held by generals or diplomats. It was held by a Garda sergeant who radioed his superiors instead of releasing armed foreign soldiers. It was held by an Irish government that defended sovereignty despite threats of economic sanctions. It was held by a British government that eventually accepted that elite military forces cannot operate beyond the constraints of international law, no matter how elite they are. If you think the story of what made this incident possible, not the arrests themselves, but the structure of decisions behind them, deserves to be told fully, share this, because the history of Flagstaff Hill cannot compel your attention. Nothing is stopping you from giving it. And if you want to understand how the same institutional failures, the dismissal of political constraints in favor of military necessity, shaped British and American Special Forces operations in the decades that followed, subscribe. Because this is not the first time institutions were embarrassed by forces they could not control. The pattern runs considerably further than 1976. The 8 soldiers were never named publicly beyond the trial records.